When my wife moved into our home, she never expected the neighborhood to feel like a battlefield. But the HOA, led by Karen, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, made it her personal mission to break us. It all started with a ridiculous fine, a claim that my wife's car was parked 2 inches outside of the line. She ignored it, thinking common sense would prevail. Instead, Karen doubled down, calling the police to enforce her nonsense. But when the officer stepped onto my porch and saw me, the smug smile drained from his face. His hand froze on his belt. He blinked twice, pale as a ghost. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the words that made Karen stumble. Back in shock, "Judge, it's you." In that instant, the game changed. Karen thought she had power. She didn't know who she was really dealing with. When my wife and I moved into the neighborhood, we expected the usual adjustment period: new faces, different routines, and maybe a few friendly waves from the people next door. At first glance, it was the kind of suburban place people dream of. Neat lawns, quiet evenings, children riding bicycles under street lamps. But what nobody mentioned during the house tour, and what no realtor brochure ever included, was the shadow that hung over the cul-de-sac. That shadow had a name, and it was Karen. Karen wasn't elected mayor, but she acted like she had been crowned ruler of the entire subdivision. She was the head of the HOA board, which she seemed to treat less like a volunteer committee and more like a personal throne. Within the first week of moving in, my wife and I had already received our welcome packet from her, a folder filled with rules that read more like commandments carved in stone. There were specifications about the length of grass blades, the acceptable colors for shutters, even how many seasonal decorations could be displayed at once. My wife flipped through the papers, shaking her head, muttering, "This is ridiculous." I agreed. I thought maybe it was just formality, rules on paper that nobody really cared about. But I was wrong. Karen cared. She cared too much at first. Her presence was subtle. We'd catch her glancing at our house as she walked her dog, her eyes scanning like a building inspector. A couple of days later, a note showed up in our mailbox, written in sharp, precise handwriting. It said our trash bin had been placed 3 inches outside of the acceptable boundary line. No fine, just a warning. My wife laughed it off, crumpling the paper and tossing it aside. "Let her watch," she said. "We're not breaking any laws." But the warnings kept coming. Each week seemed to bring a new note, tucked into our mailbox like some twisted calling card. One complained about the paint shade of our mailbox apparently to matte compared to the community standard. Another criticized the flower pots on our porch, saying they weren't uniform with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I tried to shrug it off. We had both worked hard for our home, and I wasn't about to let one busybody ruin our peace. Still, I couldn't ignore the effect it was having on my wife. Every time she pulled a note from the box, her shoulders tensed, her jaw tightened. She tried to keep smiling, but I knew the constant scrutiny was wearing her down. The breaking point came one Thursday afternoon. My wife had parked her car in the driveway as usual, slightly angled because she'd been carrying groceries and didn't feel like backing out to straighten it. Later that evening, she found another letter slipped under the windshield wiper. This one wasn't just a warning, it was a fine. Karen had written, in bold capital letters, that the car was encroaching beyond the painted lines of the driveway. The fine was $50. My wife brought the paper inside, her face flushed with anger. She slammed it down on the kitchen counter. "Can you believe this?" she demanded. I picked it up, reading the absurd accusation. The car was not blocking the street. It wasn't even touching the neighbor's property. It was just a car in our driveway, sitting at a slight angle. That was all. Yet somehow, Karen had decided this was worthy of punishment. I chuckled, trying to calm her down. "This is nonsense. You're not paying it." She crossed her arms. "Good, because I wasn't planning on it. Who does she think she is?" That night, we sat on the back porch, the crickets chirping around us, and talked about it. My wife was firm. She wasn't giving Karen a dime. She had every right to park in her own driveway, angled or not. I supported her completely. The HOA wasn't a court, and Karen wasn't a judge. But deep down, I knew ignoring her fine would escalate things. Karen had a taste for power, and people like her didn't let go easily. Over the next few days, Karen's behavior became bolder. We noticed her standing at the end of our driveway, snapping photos of my wife's car like she was gathering evidence for a trial. Once, when my wife came home from work, Karen approached her directly, waving the fine notice like a badge. "You can't just ignore this," Karen snapped. "It's a violation, and if you don't pay, there will be consequences." My wife didn't flinch. She looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "It's my driveway. If you don't like how I park, that's your problem." Then she walked inside, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. I admired her strength, but I also knew this was gasoline on the fire. Sure enough, within 48 hours, another letter arrived in our mailbox. This one was typed, formal, stamped with the HOAS letterhead. It repeated the demand for the fine, added a late fee, and warned of further action if we didn't comply. My wife tore it in half without a second thought. Karen, however, wasn't about to be ignored. If there was one thing she craved, more than control, it was recognition. She wanted us to bow, to show her that her authority mattered. So when my wife tossed her fine into the trash, Karen made her next move one that crossed the line from petty annoyance to full-blown harassment. She called the police. The day the cops showed up, the air in the neighborhood felt heavy, like a storm about to break. I was in my study, going over some papers, when I heard the sharp rap on the front door. My wife was the first to reach it, but I joined her quickly when I noticed Karen standing proudly behind the uniformed officer. Her arms folded, her expression smug. She was practically glowing with satisfaction, as though this was the victory she had been waiting for. I felt a rush of anger, not at the officer, but at Karen for dragging law enforcement into something so ridiculous. My wife got calm as ever, opened the door, and greeted the officer politely. He introduced himself, explaining there had been a complaint filed by the HOA regarding a parking violation. I saw Karen smirk, already preparing to watch us crumble under the weight of her fabricated authority, but then it happened. The moment the officer looked past my wife and saw me standing there, everything changed. His expression froze mid-sentence, his eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back. It was as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His hand twitched at his side, hovering near his belt, not in threat but in shock. His voice dropped an octave as he blinked twice, staring at me like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Judge," he said, barely above a whisper, "it's you." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My wife raised an eyebrow, glancing at me with a hint of amusement. Karen, however, looked confused, her smirk fading as the officer's reaction betrayed something she hadn't anticipated. She had expected backup, a badge to enforce her will. Instead, she had brought someone face to face with a man who was far beyond her reach for the first time since moving in. I saw Karen's confidence crack, and in that moment, I realized the game had only just begun. The silence that followed the officer's question felt like it stretched for hours. Karen's smirk faltered, but she quickly tried to recover, stepping closer as if sheer volume could erase the strange tension that had filled the air. "Officer," she barked, "this man is refusing to pay a fine issued by the HOA. His wife has been violating community rules for weeks, and it's your duty to enforce order." The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed locked on me, his face pale. He cleared his throat, trying to gather himself, but his voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "Ma'am, I need you to step back for a moment." Karen blinked. "Excuse me." "Step back," he repeated, firmer this time, gesturing for her to give space. Karen scoffed, but obeyed, though she crossed her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at me as though I had somehow manipulated the officer without saying a word. My wife leaned against the doorframe, arms folded completely unfazed. "Officer," she said politely, "would you like to come inside? We can explain." He shook his head quickly. "That won't be necessary." His gaze flickered to me again, cautious and almost reverent. I wasn't aware you lived here, sir." Karen threw up her hands. "What does that matter? He still has to follow the rules. No one is above the HOA." Her words carried across the street, drawing more neighbors out of their homes. Curtains shifted, doors creaked open. Soon, half a dozen pairs of eyes were watching from porches and lawns, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Karen, always eager for an audience, mistook their curiosity for support. She straightened her posture, tilting her chin upward. "You see," she announced loudly, "this man thinks he can ignore the laws of our community. He thinks his driveway is above the rules. But the HOA has standards, and if we let one family disobey, what happens next? Chaos." Her voice echoed down the street. A few neighbors nodded hesitantly, but most remained silent, waiting. I could see it in their faces. People were tired of Karen's theatrics, though few had dared to oppose her openly. The officer finally spoke again, his tone measured. "Ma'am, let me be clear. The HOA is not law enforcement. These are civil matters. There is nothing criminal here, and therefore, nothing for me to enforce." Karen's jaw dropped. "What? Of course there is. They broke the rules." "You have to." "I don't have to do anything," he interrupted, his voice firm now, his earlier nervousness shifting into authority. "This is not a police matter." The crowd stirred. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispering to one another. For years, Karen had acted like her word carried the same weight as a judge's gavel. But here, in front of everyone, a real officer had stripped away her illusion of power. Karen's face turned bright red. She stomped one foot like a child, denied a toy. "So you're just going to let them get away with it? You're siding with them?" The officer's lips twitched into something close to a smile, though his eyes still flickered uneasily toward me. "I'm not siding with anyone, ma'am. I'm doing my job, and my job doesn't involve enforcing HOA fines." Karen sputtered, her words tangled in fury. She looked around, expecting the neighbors to back her up. But instead of applause, she found only silence. A few shook their heads and stepped back inside their houses. Others lingered, curious but unwilling to be her allies. For once, Karen was standing alone. My wife took a step forward, her voice calm and steady. "Karen, you've made your point. You don't like the way I park my car. Fine, but calling the police? That's harassment." Karen's head whipped around. "Harassment? I'm protecting the community. No, my wife replied smoothly. You're bullying your neighbors. There's a difference. The officer cleared his throat, ready to wrap things up. Ma'am, if you have an issue with your neighbor, handle it through proper civil channels. Don't call us for this again. Do you understand? Karen clenched her fists, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might explode right there in the street. But the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and she seemed to realize her performance wasn't playing the way she'd hoped. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, her dog trotting behind her. The officer lingered for a second longer. He met my eyes, a flicker of recognition still there. Then he gave a subtle nod, the kind you'd give not just out of courtesy but out of respect. Sorry for the disturbance, he said quietly, almost under his breath. Then he returned to his car and drove away, leaving the neighborhood buzzing with whispers. For the rest of the evening, the street felt electric. Neighbors approached cautiously, one by one, as though testing the waters of defying Karen's reign. A man from across the street chuckled nervously. Never thought I'd see someone stand up to her, he admitted. His wife joined him, adding, She finds us every spring for our hedges. It's exhausting. Others nodded in agreement. Stories spilled out Karen had targeted nearly everyone, nitpicking about shutters, lawns, or trash bins. She had made herself queen of the block by convincing people she was untouchable. But now, the cracks in her crown were showing. Inside our house, my wife finally let out a long breath. Well, she said, dropping onto the couch. That was something. I sat beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. She overplayed her hand. She'll be back, my wife warned. People like her don't know when to quit. I knew she was right. Karen wasn't going to vanish overnight. She'd lick her wounds, then come back swinging harder. But something had shifted. The officer's reaction, the neighbor's silence, the way Karen had stomped off alone at all, signaled that her grip on the community wasn't as ironclad as she believed. Over the next few days, that shift became clearer. Karen resumed her campaign with letters, but they carried less weight. Neighbors began comparing notes, realizing they weren't the only ones being singled out. At a block gathering that weekend, the conversation turned openly against her. For the first time, people laughed about her obsession with trash bins. One man imitated her stern walk, sending ripples of laughter through the group. My wife and I exchanged glances. We weren't alone anymore, but Karen noticed. She saw the way people began to distance themselves from her, the way the whispers no longer favored her authority, and in her mind, I was the cause. She had been embarrassed in front of the police, humiliated in front of neighbors, and all of it traced back to our refusal to bow. I spotted her a few times after that, standing at her window, watching our house like a hawk. Her glare burned holes through the blinds. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. One evening, as my wife and I walked the dog around the block, Karen appeared suddenly, blocking the sidewalk. Her smile was tight, her tone sugary, but laced with venom. You think you're clever, don't you? Hiding behind whatever reputation you have, but this is my community, my rules. I didn't rise to her bait. My wife, however, met her gaze evenly. It's not your community, Karen. It belongs to everyone who lives here. And we're done letting you bully us. Karen's smile slipped, her mask cracking just enough to reveal the fury underneath. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss. This isn't over, not even close. Then she spun on her heel and marched away, her threats lingering in the air like storm clouds. That night, as we sat in the living room, I thought about her words. She wasn't wrong, this wasn't over. Karen had built her identity on control. Losing it wasn't something she would accept quietly. But what she didn't realize was that the more she pushed, the more the neighborhood was beginning to see through her. Her empire was fragile, and every tantrum she threw made the foundation weaker. My wife sipped her tea, calm despite the encounter. She doesn't scare me, she said simply. I smiled, though I knew we were heading into deeper waters. Karen wasn't backing down, and neither were we. That battle for peace in our own home had just begun, and the lines were clearer than ever. Karen's threat lingered in the back of my mind for days. She wasn't the type to bluff, and I knew she was stewing over her humiliation. The neighborhood had watched her lose control, and that was something Karen couldn't tolerate. I could almost imagine her pacing her living room, drafting plans, scribbling furious notes. Determined to regain the grip she believed was slipping through her fingers, the first sign of her counterattack arrived in the form of a thicker-than-usual envelope tucked into our mailbox. My wife opened it at the kitchen table, unfolding page after page of typed violations, each one more absurd than the last. There were accusations about our lawn not being evenly trimmed, our porch light being too bright, even a complaint that our recycling bin had been placed at the curb 15 minutes too early on collection day. My wife let out a sharp laugh. She's lost her mind. She slapped the papers onto the table. This isn't about rules anymore, it's about revenge. I skimmed the stack, shaking my head. She thinks burying us in paper will wear us down. But the truth was, Karen wasn't just targeting us. Over the next week, I heard from neighbors who had suddenly found themselves receiving violation notices too. The couple across the street were cited for having garden gnomes that weren't aesthetically consistent. The young family next door was accused of leaving sidewalk chalk drawings visible too long. Even the elderly widow 2 doors down, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, received a notice claiming her bird feeder was non. Karen's desperation was on full display, but instead of tightening her grip, she was pushing people away. At first the neighbors grumbled quietly, afraid to confront her directly, but whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into plans. People began to gather in small clusters at dusk, trading stories about their ridiculous finds, shaking their heads at Karen's antics. One evening, while my wife and I were out walking, we stopped to chat with Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, the retired couple who lived on the corner. Mrs. Alvarez clutched a notice in her hand, her eyes blazing. "She'll find us $200 for planting roses," she exclaimed. Roses. She said the color was too bold for the neighborhood scheme. Mr. Alvarez shook his head, his voice low but firm. "We're tired of this. We've put up with her nonsense long enough." Others joined in, their frustration boiling over. It was clear Karen had gone too far, and for the first time, people weren't looking to us to fight alone, they were ready to stand together. The real turning point came when the HOA announced its next board meeting. Normally, only a handful of residents showed up, leaving Karen and her loyal circle of cronies to make decisions unchecked. But this time, word spread quickly. If the neighborhood wanted change, this was the chance. The night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with energy. The parking lot overflowed, cars lining the street. Inside, the folding chairs were filled with neighbors who had never bothered attending before. My wife and I took our seats near the middle, quietly observing the unusual turnout. You could feel the undercurrent of tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Karen, seated at the front table, clearly hadn't expected such a crowd. She forced a tight smile, tapping her pen against a clipboard, pretending to welcome the increased interest. But I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. Her usual allies sat stiffly beside her. Whispering nervously to one another, she called the meeting to order, launching into her typical speech about preserving community standards. Her voice was crisp, authoritative, but it lacked the confidence it once carried. The murmurs in the audience grew louder with each mention of fines and rules. When she moved to the agenda item about enforcement procedures, the room practically vibrated with frustration. That was when Mrs. Alvarez stood. Her voice trembled at first, but it quickly gained strength. "I've lived here for 25 years, she said firmly, holding up her notice, "and never have I been treated with such disrespect. Roses are not a crime. You've turned this neighborhood into a prison camp." The room erupted with murmurs of agreement. Karen tried to cut her off, banging a gavel, but others were already on their feet. The young father from next door raised his voice. "My kids can't even draw with chalk without you threatening us. That's not protecting the community, that's harassment." More voices joined in, overlapping, echoing through the hall. Karen banged her gavel harder, her face turning red. "Order. I demand order," she shouted. But her demand only fueled the unrest. The crowd wasn't afraid anymore. My wife leaned toward me, whispering, "She's losing them." I nodded. "She already lost them, she just doesn't see it yet." Finally, one of the board members, an older man who usually sat silently by Karen's side, spoke up. His voice carried a hint of shame. Maybe we need to reconsider how enforcement is being handled. These fines are getting out of hand." Karen whipped around to glare at him, her eyes wide with betrayal. "Are you questioning me?" she hissed. But he didn't back down. He adjusted his glasses and faced the crowd. "The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not terrorize it." That statement cracked the dam. The neighbors erupted into applause, clapping and cheering. Karen's gavel slammed against the table again and again, but her authority was gone. She could demand order, but she couldn't command respect. In the chaos, my wife finally stood. She didn't shout. She didn't wave papers or demand justice. She simply raised her voice enough to be heard. "We moved here for peace. For community, not for constant battles over mailboxes and cars. We deserve better than this." The applause returned, even louder this time. People turned toward her, nodding, clapping, smiling in agreement. Karen, meanwhile, sat rigid in her chair, her face pale now, her power slipping like sand through her fingers. By the end of the night, the board voted over Karen's furious objections to suspend all pending fines until a full review of the enforcement process could be conducted. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was the beginning of one. Karen stormed out of the hall before the meeting officially adjourned, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. As neighbors spilled into the parking lot afterward, the mood was lighter than it had been in months. People laughed, shook hands, shared stories. My wife and I were approached repeatedly, thanked for standing up, for not giving in when Karen pushed hardest. I reminded them gently that it wasn't just us, it was everyone standing together that had made the difference tonight. But even as I smiled, I couldn't shake the image of Karen's face as she left the meeting. She wasn't defeated, not in her mind. She was humiliated, cornered, and angry. And a person like Karen, when stripped of power, doesn't go quietly. Sure enough, over the following days, her behavior grew even more erratic. She stopped speaking to neighbors altogether, refusing even to wave during her walks. Instead, she lurked in windows, her blinds barely cracked as she watched. Occasionally, we'd catch her snapping pictures again, though she no longer left notices. It was as if she were waiting, planning her next strike. One evening, my wife found an anonymous letter slid under our door. It wasn't typed on HOA letterhead, and it wasn't signed. But the sharp, aggressive handwriting was unmistakable. It accused us of inciting rebellion, warned that we would regret challenging authority, and threatened that justice was coming. My wife read it aloud, then tossed it onto the table. "She's unraveling." I picked it up, scanning the words. The threats were empty, desperate, but I knew enough about people like Karen to recognize that desperation could make her dangerous. Still, the tide had turned. The neighbors had seen behind the curtain. They had stood up, spoken out, and realized Karen wasn't invincible. The illusion of her control was shattered, and no amount of threats could rebuild it. As I sat on the porch that night, the quiet hum of the neighborhood surrounding me, I thought about how quickly power can shift. For years, Karen had ruled through fear and intimidation, but fear only works until people stop being afraid. And once the spell is broken, there's no putting it back together. Karen didn't know it yet, but her reign was crumbling, and the more she fought to hold on, the faster it would collapse. After the stormy HOA meeting, most neighbors breathed easier, relieved that Karen's iron grip had been weakened. The street even felt lighter. Kids chalked up the sidewalks again. The Alvarez roses bloomed without fear of fines, and people began gathering in front yards to chat without constantly glancing over their shoulders. For the first time since moving in, my wife and I felt like we were part of a community rather than prisoners in it. But Karen was nowhere to be seen. For days she disappeared from her usual patrols. No more photos, no more notes slipped into mailboxes. Her blinds stayed shut, her porch empty. Neighbors speculated she was sulking or planning. But everyone knew one thing: Karen wasn't the type to vanish quietly. The calm broke late one Friday evening. My wife and I were finishing dinner when we heard the sound of tires screeching outside. Peeking through the window, we saw a car pull up in front of our house. Out stepped a man in a cheap suit, holding a folder stuffed with papers. He marched straight to our door, slapped an envelope against it, and stormed back to his car without a word. My wife opened the door, retrieved the envelope, and ripped it open at the kitchen table. Her face hardened as she scanned the contents. "She's hired a lawyer," she said flatly. I took the papers from her, reading carefully. They weren't official court documents, no stamp, no docket number, no judge's signature. Just a stack of printed pages filled with legal-sounding jargon, accusing us of community defamation, incitement against the HOA, and emotional damages supposedly caused by our refusal to comply with her rules. At the end was a demand: pay $5,000 in settlement, or face further legal action. My wife rolled her eyes. "She really thinks this will scare us." I smiled faintly. "It's nothing but smoke. A real lawsuit doesn't arrive in an unmarked envelope delivered by some random guy." Still, it was proof that Karen was escalating. She wasn't satisfied with losing control. She wanted revenge, and she was willing to fake the law itself to get it. The next morning, word spread quickly. Several neighbors received nearly identical envelopes. The Alvarez couple got one. The young family with the chalk drawings got one. Even the widow with the bird feeder had a notice threatening fines for emotional disruption. It was clear Karen wasn't targeting just us anymore. She was lashing out at anyone she saw as disloyal. By Sunday afternoon, the neighborhood was in an uproar. People gathered in our driveway, clutching their envelopes, venting their outrage. "She's lost her mind," Mrs. Alvarez cried. "This isn't leadership, it's harassment." A younger neighbor, Jason, shook his head. "We should call the police again. Isn't this fraud?" I considered his words carefully. Not quite. But it is intimidation. And if she keeps it up, we'll have grounds for real legal action. The group murmured in agreement. For the first time, people weren't just angry, they were ready to act. The fear Karen once inspired had evaporated. Karen must have noticed, because that night, she tried again. Around 9 p.m., red and blue lights suddenly flashed down our street. Another patrol car parked in front of my house. Neighbors rushed to their windows, curtains fluttering. My wife gave me a weary glance as I stepped outside to meet the officer. It wasn't the same man as before. This one was younger, more rigid, with the kind of expression that said he was still taking Karen seriously. He adjusted his belt and cleared his throat. "Sir, we've received multiple calls from the HOA about ongoing disturbances. Apparently you've been leading, what did she call it? A rebellion against community authority. The absurdity of..." The words nearly made me laugh. Instead, I kept my face calm. "Officer, this is a civil matter. The HOA has no authority to involve law enforcement." Before he could respond, Karen stormed out of her house. She was dressed in a blazer, her hair pulled tight, clutching a stack of papers like they were evidence for a trial. "That's him," she shouted, pointing at me as though identifying a fugitive. "He's encouraging everyone to defy the HOA. He's destroying this neighborhood." The officer frowned, caught between her hysteria and my composure. "Ma'am, calm down. Let me handle this." "Calm down," she shrieked. "He's dangerous. He thinks he's above the rules. You need to arrest him." The neighbors began spilling out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some carried their fake legal letters, waving them like proof. Voices rose from the crowd, contradicting Karen's claims. "She's lying. She's harassing us. She threatened my kids over chalk." The officer looked overwhelmed, glancing from "Me too, Karen" to the swelling crowd. My wife stepped forward, holding one of the letters out to him. "Here, this is what she's been sending around. Do these look legitimate to you?" He took the paper, scanning it quickly. His eyebrows furrowed. This isn't a real, legal document." He looked up at Karen. "Where did this come from?" Karen sputtered. It's official. I consulted legal advice." "From who?" he pressed. Her face turned red. "That's none of your business." The crowd began laughing, the sound rolling across the street like a wave. Karen's power was crumbling in real time, her words falling flat, her authority mocked openly. The officer shook his head, clearly realizing he'd been dragged into nonsense. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "if you keep making false reports, there will be consequences. Police resources are not here to enforce HOA drama." Karen gasped, scandalized. "Drama? This is order. This is my community." But her voice cracked, and everyone heard it. The neighbors erupted again, some booing, others simply walking away, dismissing her entirely. Karen stood frozen, shaking with rage, her face blotchy red under the streetlight. The officer handed the fake letter back to my wife, gave me a respectful nod, and returned to his car. As the patrol car drove away, Karen stood alone in the middle of the street, clutching her useless stack of papers, her kingdom collapsing around her. That night, the neighborhood felt different. People lingered outside, laughing together, sharing relief. Children rode bikes past Karen's house unbothered, their parents no longer shushing them in fear. The illusion of her power had finally shattered, but even as I watched the laughter ripple across the street, I knew Karen wasn't finished. Her pride had been wounded too deeply. She had been exposed, humiliated, mocked in front of the very people she used to control. And a person like Karen doesn't surrender, they plot. Sure enough, over the next week, she grew quieter but stranger. No more letters, no more shouting. Instead, she lingered in shadows, her blinds barely open, her eyes following anyone who walked past. Sometimes, at night, my wife and I would spot her pacing her driveway, muttering under her breath, clutching her phone as though speaking to someone we couldn't see. One evening, while walking our dog, we passed her house and heard her voice through an open window. "They'll regret this," she hissed. "All of them. They don't know who they're dealing with." My wife squeezed my hand, whispering she's unraveling. I nodded, my eyes fixed on Karen's darkened window. She was planning something bigger. And whatever it was, it would be her last, desperate attempt to claw back control. The battle wasn't over. The storm was still gathering. Karen's silence was louder than her shouting ever had been. A week passed, then two, and the neighborhood lived in an uneasy peace. Children played in the streets again, neighbors held cookouts without fear, and laughter began to replace the tension that had ruled our block for years. But everyone knew Karen was still lurking, waiting for her chance. People saw her late at night, pacing her yard, whispering into her phone, or scribbling frantically in notebooks. My wife warned me, "She's not done. She's waiting for the right time." I believed her. Karen had lost face, lost power, but she hadn't lost her obsession. An obsession doesn't just die at festers. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned from work when 3 police cars, lights flashing, roared into the neighborhood. They blocked the street in front of my driveway. Neighbors poured out of their homes in confusion as the officers climbed out, their expressions sharp and serious. At their center stood Karen, her blazer buttoned tight, her hair perfectly sprayed into place, her smug smile back in full force. She carried a thick binder under one arm and strutted toward me like a queen leading her army. "There he is," she declared, pointing at me. "That's the man. Arrest him immediately for fraud, defamation," and she flipped open the binder dramatically. "For impersonating a judge." Gasps rippled through the neighbors. Some laughed outright, but others looked worried. The officers turned to me, their hands resting on their belts. "Sir," one said carefully, "we need to clear this up. She's made some serious allegations." Karen smirked, eyes glittering with triumph. "You see? He tricked everyone into thinking he was some kind of authority, but I have proof he's been spreading lies and pretending to be above the law." The officers hesitated. Then one of them stepped forward, pulling a sheet from Karen's binder. He studied it, frowned, then turned to me. "Sir, is it true you hold a position in the county court system?" The crowd fell silent. My wife stood beside me, her hand tightening on mine. I drew a steady breath and nodded. "Yes, I am a judge. County Circuit Court, Division 3. The officers stiffened. Karen's smirk faltered. Murmurs rippled through the neighbors like wind through leaves. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my official identification, the seal of the state court gleaming under the fading sunlight. The lead officer's eyes widened as he took it, scanning carefully. When he looked back at me, his tone had shifted completely, respectful, controlled. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I wasn't aware." Karen's voice cracked. "What? No. He's lying. That has to be fake." The officer shook his head firmly. "This is as real as it gets. Ma'am, I can assure you, no one impersonates a judge and lives to tell the tale. This is legitimate." The Crowd erupted. Laughter, cheers, disbelief all at once. The truth had landed, and it struck harder than any accusation Karen had ever thrown. My wife's eyes shimmered with relief, and I felt the weight I'd carried for weeks lift at last. Karen, though it was unraveling, her binder slipped from her hands, papers spilling across the pavement. She shook her head violently, pointing at me with trembling fingers. No, you don't understand. He's the villain here. He's destroying everything I built. But no one listened anymore. The officers, now fully aware of her false claims, turned their focus on her. Ma'am, one said sharply, you've made repeated false reports, harassed your neighbors, and attempted to misuse law enforcement. That ends tonight. Karen's face drained of color. You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. Not anymore, came a voice from the crowd. It was Jason, the young neighbor. He held up a document, signed by dozens of homeowners. We voted you out last week. The board is dissolved. The timing was poetic. Karen's authority crumbled in real time, each word striking her like a blow. The officers moved closer, their patience at an end. Ma'am, you need to come with us. She backed away, her voice breaking. You can't do this. I am the rules. I am the law. But it was over. The officers took her by the arms, guiding her toward the squad car. As she kicked and screamed, the neighbors stood together, no longer afraid, no longer silent. They clapped, some even whistled, as Karen was placed in the back of the car. Her reign finally shattered. My wife leaned against me, whispering, it's over. I nodded, though I kept watching as the cars pulled away. Karen's furious shouts, fading into the distance. The storm she brought to our street was gone at last. That night, the neighborhood held an impromptu celebration. Grills fired up, kids ran through sprinklers, music played. For the first time it felt like a real community, a place people wanted to live, laugh, and grow together. Mrs. Alvarez hugged me tightly, her eyes bright with gratitude. You saved us, Judge. Without you, she would have kept destroying this place. I smiled, shaking my head. I didn't save anyone. You all stood up for yourselves. That's what matters. But deep down, I knew the truth. Sometimes, standing up to bullies takes more than courage, it takes exposure. Karen built her power on lies, fear, and intimidation. Once her lies were stripped bare, she was nothing more than a person screaming into the wind. As the night wound down, I walked with my wife down the quiet street, the sound of laughter still echoing. We stopped in front of our home, the porch light casting a warm glow. She looked at me, her smile soft. Do you think she ever come back? I thought about it, then shook my head. No, she burned every bridge she had. This time it's done. And with that, we went inside, closing the door on the chaos for good. The HOA that once ruled our lives was gone. The neighborhood had its peace back. And Karen, well, she was just another cautionary tale. A reminder that power built on fear can never last forever. The community would thrive without her. And my wife and I would finally live the life we came here to build, a life free from constant surveillance, constant threats, and constant battles. A life where home truly felt like home. And that, at last, was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. Stay tuned. Your next favorite story is waiting.